This is Western Civilization 1. I'm Dr. Young, your instructor. Today we're going to turn our attention to the Hellenistic period. That's the period that began with the conquests of Alexander the Great, when the Greeks sort of went outside of Greece and came to dominate much of the Eastern Mediterranean and eventually most of the Near East. This is a important transitionary period. It's tremendously important for everything that comes after. But before we delve into that period, I want to set the stage by looking at some important primary sources. I didn't tack this on to the last video because it was running a bit long, but I wanted to talk about Greek art and architecture a bit, and in doing so we will see the important change in ethos and sensibilities and attitudes that comes with the shift into the Hellenistic period. And so the art is actually a pretty good segue from the classical into the Hellenistic, as we'll see. So I've got a couple of images here of pieces of Greek art and architecture that some of you may be familiar with. Hopefully you're familiar with the building pictured in the upper part of the slide there. This is the Parthenon. It's in Athens, on the Acropolis, which is kind of the main hill in Athens. This was the center of the city in ancient Athens. And the Parthenon was a temple dedicated to Athena, the patron goddess of the city. It was built in the 5th century, as we talked about in an earlier discussion. It was built using the funds from the Delian League that figures like Pericles co-opted for their own use. And they built this fantastic temple on the Acropolis to replace the one that had been destroyed by the Persians during the Persian Wars. And you know, in the classroom, I usually ask students, okay, what's appealing about this building? And normally the response is the columns, and of course Greek columns are one of the distinguishing features of Greek architecture. These are the most basic style of column. They're known as Doric columns. There really is no, or not much decoration on the capitals. The capitals are the place where the column itself goes into the rest of the building, both on the top and the, well, on the top the capitals are actually, but you know, decoration on the top and the bottom is one of the characteristics, and Doric columns really don't have a lot of that. Later, the Greeks would sort of in the latter part of the classical period, the Greeks began to insert some decoration on the columns, especially on the capitals, in the form of a scroll pattern, and the scroll columns are known as Ionian columns. In the Hellenistic period, these would become more and more elaborate as techniques developed and as sensibilities changed. And so we're going to look at some Hellenistic era columns later on. These are known as Corinthian columns, and we'll try to you know, get a good sense of the shifting attitudes there. The other thing that we should note about the Parthenon is the symmetry of the building and the clean lines. This is not a tremendously complicated structure. The Greeks appreciated the simplicity and symmetry of it, and that's one of the main characteristics, in fact, of Greek art and architecture is symmetry and simplicity. They have taken basic geometric shapes. You have the triangular pediment here on top of a rectangular lintel, and the lintel, of course, is the space for a lot of exploration in sculpture, relief sculpture, and things like that. And so this is all very symmetrical and not terribly complicated, but there's a pleasing aesthetic that goes along with that. And particularly in the classical period, this is really what captured the Greek imagination. We can see some of those same sensibilities in the sculpture at the bottom here. This is in bronze. It is a sculpture either of Zeus or Poseidon. It's uncertain. The arm that is drawn back there had at one time either a lightning bolt or a trident in it. But the distinguishing features of this are the great attention to detail that the sculpture has paid here. The anatomy is correct, as it were. You can see the musculature quite well. You can see individual strands of hair in the beard and on, sort of on his head. The eye sockets are not sculpted in because by the techniques of casting bronze, they had to leave openings since the eyes were good for that purpose. But the cheekbones are highly detailed. Their eyebrows. I mean, there's a lot of attention to detail here. The other thing that we might note about the Zeus sculpture, and we'll see this in a couple of other examples, is that this is a figure who is poised about to do something. He has drawn back the lightning bolt. He is about to throw it, but the sculpture is not yet able to capture motion. There's a lot of attention to detail, but the techniques of the classical period did not yet figure out how to really capture something truly in motion. And that might also speak to the sensibilities and kind of the aesthetic sensibilities of the classical period. They seem to have appreciated what we might call potential energy, something about to move, the calm before the storm, as it were. Kind of literally in the case of Zeus, right? The beard and things like that do, I suppose, have some complexity to them, but even there's a kind of symmetry to it. You can see the part in his hair on his forehead, so that's quite symmetrical. The other thing is the face. The faces are tremendously difficult to sculpt. And so the techniques of the classical period had a hard time capturing emotion and facial expressions, and that again may be part of the aesthetic sensibility of the time. There's a great calm to many of these the faces of these sculptures in the classical period, and that might have to do with sort of the way the Greeks understood the world around them. That this should be something that's sort of calmly analyzed and taken stock of, right? And so the Zeus sculpture may give us a sense of all of that. We can see this as well in some of the other sculptures from the classical period. The one on the left here is one of the most famous. This is the famous discus thrower, attributed to a famous sculptor named Myron from the first part of the 5th century. And you can see a lot of the same aesthetic tastes in this as you can in the Zeus sculpture. Now, one of the things you should note here is this is in marble rather than bronze. Bronze was the medium of choice in the classical period. There are more bronze sculptures certainly than marble, because bronze is a far more rigid material, and so a sculpture done in bronze stays together better. To do something in marble, you actually have to have a lot of supporting pillars and things like that, because especially if you're trying to produce a human being, humans have legs that are rather skinny, and so there's not enough material there to support the weight of the sculpture. So there's a reason that the discus thrower is leaned up against a tree or a pillar or something like that. That's not because they actually threw the discus that way. It's simply the expediency of producing a sculpture like this. But ignore that part. And this may be a Roman copy. There are a lot of Roman copies of earlier Greek sculptures, often done in marble instead of bronze. I cannot recall off the top of my head whether this was originally done in bronze or not. But in any case, the things I want you to look at are, again, the attention to detail, the musculature of the figure, also a kind of symmetry to this. The arms are offsetting each other. The whole sculpture itself sort of holds around a central axis point, even though he's leaning forward, and the torso in any case there is a kind of central axis to this. But notice the face in particular, right? This is not somebody who is in the process of expending a tremendous amount of energy to throw the discus as far as he can to win the olive wreath at the Olympics or something. This is a calm face, and again, this might be due to the techniques that were available, but it might also capture the aesthetic sensibilities of the time. The discus thrower is about to do something. This is potential energy rather than something truly in motion. Now, compare that to the sculpture on the right. This is still classical period, but it's rather late. This is the second part of the 5th century. This is the sculpture is known as the Dying Niobid. This is one of the daughters of Niobe, and anyway, she, her daughters were all killed because of her hubris. I don't know if you know the mythological story, but Niobe angered a goddess, and her whole family sort of had the wrath of the goddess upon them. And so this is one of the daughters of Niobe who is in the process of dying. She's been stabbed in the back or something like that. And here we can see the development of techniques. If you look at the face, it captures emotion. There is an intensity to that expression. You know, an expression of grief or of pain or something like that. This is also one of the very first nudes, and so it captures a kind of eroticism that will be elaborated upon in the Hellenistic period. The other notable thing about this sculpture is the drapery. You note that it doubles as a kind of supporting pillar so that the marble can support the weight of the rest of the sculpture. But the cloth looks like it's moving. The sculptor here has captured not only emotion, but also the motion of the cloth, so that this is no longer just potential energy, there is some kinetic energy involved in this. And tastes were moving in that direction as time went on, as is quite obvious, and that may be partially due to the kind of broad movements of peoples during the Hellenistic period. This is a period when the Greeks began to interact with others on a much more personal level. Alexander took his armies and conquered the Persian Empire, and we see the blending of cultures, the blending of sensibilities and attitudes and aesthetics and things like that. And so, and there was also a real sense of dislocation and loss of identity. People felt kind of troubled by the circumstances of their world at times, it seems, and so the art begins to capture this. If we look at a couple of really famous and wonderful sculptures from the Hellenistic period, we get a sense of this quite well. The one on the left is called the Nike, Winged Victory of Samothrace. It seems that this sculpture was originally intended for the prow of a ship. And if you notice, the sculptor has captured here not only motion, you can see the wind whipping through her clothes, but also, you can see the musculature underneath the drapery. The sculpture, the figure looks like she is wet, that the sea spray has gotten to her clothing, and this is a goddess. This is a form of the goddess Athena, so it's quite grand as well. But the motion and the truly highly developed techniques here really stand out. This is one of the most famous sculptures in the Louvre, which is arguably the most famous art museum in the world. It's in a wonderful place in the Louvre, too, right at the top of a staircase with all kinds of lights in it. It's something that if you have the chance, you really want to see at some point in your life. Now, the one on the right is a bit different. A bronze sculpture here. It's called the Boxer because you can see this is a person who has competed in boxing. He's got the leather gloves on his hands, like they wore in Greek boxing events in the Olympic Games, for instance. But this is a boxer who probably has gone a few too many rounds in the ring, right? He's quite old. His face is damaged. If you can look closely at his ears, you'll see that his ears have been beaten to the point that the cartilage is all broken up, and he has what's called cauliflower ear. And there's a kind of a profound grief or sadness on his face, right? Life has dealt him some very difficult blows. He's tried to hold on to this dream for too long, and his dreams have been shattered, and he's just sort of a beaten man, it seems. And Hellenistic sculpture, paid attention to these kinds of things. It didn't depict only gods and goddesses and heroes and things like that, stories from mythology. It also tried to capture the base of human existence, the common people to some extent, warts and all. And the Boxer is a really good example of that. Maybe my favorite sculpture from the Hellenistic period is this one. This is from mythology. This is the sculpture of the figure named called Laocoon, who was the priest of the Temple of Apollo at Troy, and he tried to oppose the Trojans, according to the mythological story. He tried to get them to not bring the horse into the city of Troy. And given that the gods had turned against Troy, Poseidon sent a couple of sea serpents out of the sea, and they devoured Laocoon and his two young sons, and that's what's captured here. And you can simply look at the face of Laocoon and see the intense emotion, the grief or the pain or the sadness that he's undergoing here. Again, there's a tremendous amount of attention to detail in the anatomy. The veins on his legs, for instance, and his arms are captured well. All of the musculature. There's a lot of motion going on here. The snakes seem to be slithering before you. He's trying to fight them off. So this really captures all of the advanced techniques of the Hellenistic period, but also gives us a sense of this. The movement of the Hellenistic world. So hopefully that's a good introduction to the changing sensibilities of these times. The Hellenistic world was created by a single figure, Alexander the Great. And he is truly one of the gigantic figures in Western history, enigmatic, the source of an endless number of legends over many centuries, a figure who has excited the imagination of people for almost 2.5 millennia at this point. Alexander was the son of Philip II of Macedon. And I talked in a previous lecture about Philip in the 340s and 330s. He managed through a skillful combination of diplomacy and military threat to become the master of the Greek world. All of the Greek poleis kind of lined up behind him, paid tribute to him in the form of monetary tribute, as well as kind of giving assent to his rule. Many Greeks were not terribly happy about this because they considered the Macedonians to be barbarians, even though they shared a culture and most Macedonians spoke Greek. They did have some key differences in social organization and culture and heritage and things like that as well. But Philip was a tremendously skillful leader. In the year 338 BCE, Philip was assassinated, though. And his son Alexander was only a teenager at the time, 16, 17, 18, something like that. I guess he was about 17 or 18. There was some intrigue in the court. Somebody who wanted to supplant Philip was involved in the assassination. And so Alexander showed his mettle, even at that very young age, in sort of getting rid of all of his rivals. He managed to track down his father's murderer and have him put to death, as well as all the conspirators. His father, the Macedonians practiced multiple marriage or plural marriage, polygyny, and his father had taken a new wife and kind of supplanted Alexander's mother. This wife had borne him a son. Alexander had his kind of stepmother and his younger brother put to death so that he had no rivals. So he showed himself to be quite ruthless as well. And then after, the Greeks, by the way, had chosen, after the assassination of Philip, to rebel. And so Alexander marched an army down and destroyed the city of Thebes and forced the obedience of Athens and the other cities who were thinking about rebelling as well. And he quickly became, again, the master of the Greek world. And then shortly after that, only a couple of years after consolidating his rule, he put into process his father's plan to invade the Persian Empire. Now, this is where we could get really bogged down in narrative. I don't think it would be time ill spent necessarily to talk about the narrative of the conquest of Alexander the Great. But I'm going to do it in rather short detail. I'm going to leave a lot of things out here. You're welcome to read into this to your heart's content. It should be noted, first of all, that Alexander understood the disadvantages that he operated under. His army was small, only a few thousand, maybe a few tens of thousands of men, compared to the Persians, who could field an army of several 100,000. But Alexander knew that the Persian army was made up mostly of mercenaries, who, if they saw that they were losing and likely not to get paid, would probably give up the field, and so he exploited that characteristic of the Persian army a number of times. He also picked his battles very carefully, and often did so in ways that gave him a strategic advantage. And so that's one of the things we should note about Alexander. He was a tremendously skillful military strategist, maybe the most skillful military strategist in all of human history. And that's putting him up there with some pretty elite company like Napoleon and Hannibal and some other figures that we'll talk about Hannibal later in this class at least, but other figures from Western civilization who were really giant figures. But so he's a skilled military strategist, but he also did things symbolically. Alexander was heavily invested in culture. He was a Macedonian, but he embraced parts of Greek culture that were really important to him. He loved the mythology. It seems he carried a copy of the Iliad with him everywhere he went. And so when he invaded the Persian Empire, the first place he chose to strike was right at the site of Troy. Symbolically, this was another Greek invasion of this foreign barbarian outpost, and Alexander attacked that place. The Battle of Granicus River took place near Troy, and he was successful at this. And this was really only against the kind of the Persian advanced garrison on the frontier. It wasn't the full army. Alexander was nearly killed in that battle. He was saved by one of his men. But upon winning victory, as you can see, he took a path rather than straight for the heartland of Persia, down here through Ionia. And if we recall, this territory was entirely Greek-speaking, pretty much. And he proclaimed to the Ionian Greeks that they had been liberated. Sorry, accidentally hit the advance there. That they had been liberated, and the Greeks were skeptical of Alexander. He was a Macedonian, he was a barbarian, they weren't sure he was going to be any better than the Persians, but he showed, he tried to present himself as their liberator. However, upon moving further to the east, he decided to keep the Persian structures of governance in place. He installed a governor in the city of Sardis and proclaimed that all of this territory in Ionia was to be ruled from Sardis. And so really it was just status quo, and many Greeks became disenchanted with Alexander as a result of that. Now, he did march finally further east, and his second major battle was fought at a place called Issus, close to the city, what became the city of Antioch later on. I'll talk about that later in this lecture. But at Issus, Alexander managed to lure the massive Persian army into a narrow valley where they could not deploy their troops at their full width, and his soldiers were far superior to the Macedonian mercenary troops, and he managed to defeat Darius, the Persian emperor, on that occasion. Darius had rather foolhardily brought his entire family with him on this expedition, and he had to abandon his position quite rapidly, and so he left his family behind, and they fell into the hands of Alexander, and Alexander was able to use the family of Darius as a kind of bargaining chip in his further strategy. Now, with these hostages in tow, Alexander, rather than, again, go for the heartland of Persia, he went down the Mediterranean coast of the Levant, down here to the city of Tyre, because he knew the Persians had a strong navy. They were mostly docked in places like Tyre, and so he besieged these cities, took control of them, and thus secured the Persian navy so they could not sail the navy up to Macedonia and attack his homeland and force him to turn around and go back and defend it. From there, he took the unusual step of coming down into Egypt. And in Egypt, he proclaimed himself to be the liberator of the Egyptian people. And he even took this side journey all the way out here to a place called Siwa, to a temple of the god Ra, the sun god, kind of the sky god of the Egyptian pantheon, at Siwa. Now, this was an important symbolic move for Alexander, because, and this, I don't want to, do too much, give you too much information here and overwhelm you, but in the ancient polytheistic religions of the Eastern Mediterranean, peoples who interacted with each other, the Egyptians with the Greeks, for instance, often conflated their gods with the gods of the people they were talking with. And so Ra would have been confused, or conflated, rather, in the mind of the Greeks with the god Zeus. And Alexander went out to the temple of Ra at Siwa and came back convinced that he was the son of Zeus. Something happened in his interaction with the priests there where they hailed him as the son of Ra, probably just trying to win favor from him. But he was fully convinced that he was actually the son of a god. Now, we might be cynical and say, he was just doing that to kind of play to the masses or something. But Alexander seems to have taken this pretty seriously. Again, he was steeped in mythology. He admired the story of Heracles, or Hercules, who was the son of Zeus, and may have felt that he was kind of a Hercules incarnate, or a reborn Hercules, or something like that. And this won him great favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, who were accustomed to being ruled by pharaohs who were gods in human form. And the Egyptians hailed him as a liberator. He founded a city there called Alexandria, named after himself. And finally, he, after spending all this time in Egypt, he resumed his campaign, taking his army all the way into Mesopotamia to engage with the full Persian force that Darius had mustered there. The Battle of Gaugamela is one of the most enigmatic and important in all of ancient history. There are many accounts, but none of them are terribly complete, and none of them come from the actual time period of Alexander, and so we don't know exactly what happened. What seems to be the case is that Alexander was not only outnumbered, but outflanked, but he made directly for the position of Darius with his elite troops. Darius got scared, turned around, fled the battlefield, hoping to regroup somewhere else in his empire, but given that the Persian command and control structures were not well equipped to handle such an eventuality, the soldiers kind of gave up. They were confused about what to do, and Alexander's troops were victorious. This gave him access to the city of Babylon, which was the largest city of the Persian Empire, and also access to the key cities, kind of the capital cities of Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana. Now, Alexander continued with his strategy here, and this strategy is important and really kind of key to understanding the whole Hellenistic era, the whole Hellenistic period. When Alexander got to Babylon, much as he had done with the Egyptians, he proclaimed himself to be the son of Marduk, the city god of Babylon. Right? Now, Alexander probably conflated Marduk with Ra and with Zeus and thought they were all the same god. The Babylonians absolutely ate this up. Alexander tried to be all things to all people. He tried to present himself as one of them. And he began to insist that his men, his Macedonian troops, mix and mingle with the local population. He held mass weddings, for instance, in Babylon, where he married Macedonian soldiers to Babylonian women, all of this to ingratiate himself with the local population. The net result of this is what we might call cultural fusion. The blending of peoples and their cultures to create a new thing, a new culture. Right, that has characteristics of both of the old cultures. And that's precisely what Alexander was trying to do. He did the same thing with the Persians. On the one hand, to appease the Greeks He destroyed, I think it was the city of Persepolis, which was kind of a religious center for the Persians. He destroyed the city of Persepolis because the Persians had destroyed the city of Athens during the Persian Wars, and this was in retribution for that. But he preserved the other cities, and he quickly set about rebuilding Persepolis after he destroyed it. And so he's trying to appease the Greeks, but he was trying to placate the Persians as well. Everywhere Alexander went, he tried to pass himself off as a local, as a native. And in fact, he began to talk about being the kinsman of Darius and the legitimate heir to the throne. The problem was that Darius was still alive. He had fled to the eastern part of his empire, over here to Bactria. And so Alexander took off after sort of securing his position here in Persia. Took off after him. When he got to Bactria, he was informed that Darius had been put to death by the governor of Bactria, who had proclaimed himself to be the new Persian emperor. And so Alexander fought against him and defeated him and secured Bactria. And again, he married a Bactrian woman. Alexander ended up with something like 9 wives by the end of his life. Married a Bactrian princess. Tried to ingratiate himself with the local population. But Alexander was never content to stay in one place and govern, and many of his troops began at this point to say, when are we going to stop? Shouldn't we enjoy the fruits of our conquests? Alexander continued to force them on. At one point, after Bactria, he came up here into this region called Sogdiana, really into the foothills of the Himalaya Mountains, all the way to the Oxyartes River. Founded another city called Alexandria up there. When he saw that these mountains were really quite impassable, he went back to Bactria. But then he heard about these kingdoms down here in the Indus Valley, and so he marched his troops all the way down here through the Indus Valley, through campaign after campaign against kingdom after kingdom. Many of the troops died of either battlefield wounds or diseases, and they were getting sick of this whole process of conquest. When he got to the Arabian Sea, to the mouth of the Indus River, Alexander, in talking with locals, heard about another river to the east across India called the Ganges. And according to Alexander's understanding, the Ganges flowed into the Eastern Ocean. The Ganges represented the end of the landmass of the world. And so if he conquered all the way to the Ganges, Alexander thought he will have conquered the entire world. That was his ambition. Was to just keep conquering, right? He wasn't so interested in governing necessarily. He sort of left the Persian structures in place. He wanted more conquest. At this point, he tried to convince his troops to do this, and they rebelled. They had full-scale mutiny, and Alexander was forced to relent. He did, however, extract a promise from his troops that they would return, after they returned to Babylon in 1 year, he would bring an army back and continue his conquests. And in fact, Alexander had probably planned to disband his current army. He had been training new soldiers, mostly Babylonian and Persian soldiers, in the techniques of the Macedonian phalanx. Those troops would be ready to go when he got back to Babylon, and so that was probably his plan. However, on the way back to Babylon, he became very ill. And shortly after arriving in Babylon, he died. He was only 32 years old at that point. Now, what did he die of? Good question. Probably some disease. We should not, however, rule out poison. He had made a lot of enemies. Even many of his troops who had mutinied against him were unhappy with him, possibly thought about replacing him. His Bactrian wife, Roxana, was pregnant with a child, and they saw that they probably needed to move into position at that point, or, Alexander's heir would be firmly in place. It is also possible that he died of some chronic disease, that contributed at least to his death, that he had been hiding for some time. Alexander was tremendously sexually active with partners of both genders. And so we cannot, I suppose, rule out sexually transmitted disease of some kind, maybe syphilis. He also lived a very, very hard life. He drank a lot, so maybe cirrhosis of the liver was involved in this. He suffered wound upon wound on the battlefield. One of the things you should note about Alexander is he was not a commander like Darius, who sat at the back of the army and gave commands. He fought in the front lines of all the battles. He was either on horseback or in the infantry, in the phalanx. Alexander had to be carried from the battlefield numerous times, unconscious, because he had lost so much blood. And so he lived in 32 years, the equivalent of, probably many, many decades beyond that. He was an old man, physically, by the time he got back to Babylon. In any case, Alexander's death meant the end of this massive empire as he perhaps had intended it to be constituted. Very quickly, his generals all fell into squabbles with one another over rule, each one wanting to take the place of Alexander, none of them with the personality or the backing to do that. And the ultimate result of this was a divided empire. The empire was quickly divided up into several smaller kingdoms, some of them quite large, some of them over time at least rather small. I'm not going to go into the complicated process of how this happened. It would take much longer than the time we have. But to name them, okay, Greece and Macedonia were known as the Antigonid Kingdom, after the ruler named Antigonus, whom Alexander had left in charge in Macedonia when he left to begin his conquests. The Antigonid Kingdom initially was larger, but then it was divided up, and this region here, Western Asia Minor and Thrace, became part of what was known as the Attalid Empire, based in the city of Pergamon. Everything in yellow you see here was known as the Seleucid Empire, after the general Seleucus, who laid claim to all of that territory. And that is by far the largest of the empires. However, that's a bit misleading. The Seleucids, after only a generation or so, really were not able to rule the eastern parts of the empire. The Indus Valley broke away and became independent again. Bactria and Sogdiana became independent. Even Persia eventually broke away, and just the Fertile Crescent was the main part of the Seleucid Empire, with particular focus on the Levant here and the city of Antioch, which you see right there. Okay. The most successful and stable of all of the Hellenistic kingdoms was the Ptolemaic Empire. As you can see here, that's spelled with a P, P-T-O-L-E-M-Y. That's Ptolemy. He was one of Alexander's generals who decided that very early on, wisely, that this kingdom or this empire was not going to survive intact, and he needed to try to get control of the most viable, stable part of the empire to have his kingdom. What place was more stable than Egypt? And so he set himself up as a pharaoh there, ruled from Alexandria. He did have interest in Levant and other parts, and the Ptolemies often fought with the Seleucids over control of the Levant. One of the things that Ptolemy did was to hijack the funeral cortege that was headed back to Macedonia with Alexander's body. He hijacked it, took the body down to Alexandria, and buried it in a mausoleum there, so that he could lay claim on that basis to be the legitimate heir of Alexander, who was, after all, considered a god by the Egyptians, and so Ptolemy presented himself that way too. What happened to Roxana and little Alexander, who was born a few months after his father's death? Well, initially he was declared to be the legitimate ruler, but he was quickly swept aside. Truth be told, nobody knows what happened to baby Alexander. I've often thought it was interesting that, to surmise that maybe he survived in the shadows somewhere, and I think that would actually make a pretty good scenario for a comic book or a superhero movie or something like that. The heirs of Alexander have superpowers or whatever. But anyway, all kidding aside here, each of these empires had, very positive characteristics and some drawbacks to them, so, that made them somewhat unstable, and wars continued for several generations between these various kingdoms. Now, a few key points about the Hellenistic period. With these conquests, Alexander brought Greek ideas, Greek political forms to the Near East, where large empires had been the rule of the day for, well, almost 1,000 years at that point. We talked about the New Kingdom Egyptians and the Hittites and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians and all of those. So organization on the basis of a polis with citizen involvement and things like that didn't necessarily cohere very well with this new situation. And so what we have in process is cultural fusion. Ideas, sensibilities, attitudes, values of multiple civilizations combining together in this new synthesis. And it was a time of great opportunity, but also a time of great dislocation and loss of identity. And this was doubly so because there were structures put in place that tried to break down the boundaries between people. There emerged, for instance, a couple of languages in this period that ended up being, well, the technical term for this is lingua franca, which means just a kind of a common language. A very simplified, modified form of Greek called Koine Greek was spoken and used all over these Hellenistic kingdoms. Most people, even if they didn't speak this as their mother tongue, would learn Koine Greek because it was the language of business and commerce and contact between various peoples. Aramaic, a Semitic language, emerged to fill the same role in many places, especially in the Seleucid Empire. There was a language called Aramaic, but it became this kind of common language. It filled the position very much that English does in much of the world today, where even where if people don't speak English as their native language, they have to learn it because it's the language of trade and culture and all of these things. It really has become an international language. Spanish and French occupy this to some extent in parts of the world too. So Koine Greek and Aramaic both filled those roles, and this broke down boundaries. People had to talk to each other in Koine or in Aramaic. And they lost some of their kind of local identity, as it were, right? We also see the emergence of these huge cosmopolis cities that dominated the Hellenistic era politically, economically, and culturally. Most important of these, and this is not an exhaustive list, but most important were Alexandria, the capital of the Ptolemaic Empire. The painting or the picture you see here is an artist's rendering. This isn't ancient, but a kind of imaginary rendering of what Alexandria probably looked like. The most famous feature here is this building called the Pharos, Pharos, which was arguably the world's first skyscraper. It was hundreds of feet tall. It was a lighthouse in the harbor on this peninsula. The palace of the Ptolemies was close to that on the peninsula. Unfortunately, the Pharos has not survived. It toppled and fell into the harbor, and the harbor itself has moved, and so much of the ancient city of Alexandria has now disappeared under the harbor. It's not easy to do excavations of it, and there's a shockingly small amount of information we have about Alexandria, but the stuff that we do have indicates that Alexandria was just gigantic. It may have reached a population of close to 1 million people. It was a center of trade, important political center, and a great center of cultural production. Antioch, which became the capital of the Seleucid Empire, filled a similar role there. It wasn't quite as large as Alexandria, but it had all of the amenities that Alexandria had. Pergamon, the capital of the Attalid Empire, similar kind of city, cosmopolis with people coming from all over the world to do business there, to seek opportunity there. But again, a lot of cultural and social dislocation was the result of that. Now, to try to capture this whole process of cultural fusion, I want to talk about an institution and then give a couple of examples. We'll look at some pictures of things that were produced in the Hellenistic period. The institution that I want to discuss was called the Museum. It was in Alexandria. It was connected to the palace of the Ptolemies. And don't be misled by the name. This was not a place to collect artifacts where people could come and look at them. The museum was, well, I think accurately could be characterized as the world's first research university. The Ptolemies, the rulers of Egypt, were interested in sponsoring the production of intellectual pursuits and culture and things like that, so they built the museum as a place to house scholars who they then recruited, gave comfortable lodgings and handsome stipends, so that they could create things. The word itself comes from the word muse. The muses were these mythological goddesses who sort of presided over or governed all creative endeavors. And so the museum was set up as a place where the muses could inspire people to do great things. To further enhance the projects that these scholars were working on, the Ptolemies collected books from all over the Mediterranean. They actually issued decrees stating that any traveler coming to Alexandria had to submit themselves to mandatory searches of their belongings. If the customs agents, so to speak, found books, they would confiscate them and place them in the museum. If this was an important person, they would have people at the museum make copies of those books, and they would give the copy to the person they had confiscated the book from. But this was a standing ordinance, so to speak, in the Ptolemaic Empire. And so over time, the museum came to have a gigantic library, the famous Library of Alexandria, that may have had upwards of 1 million holdings. The most prestigious scholar was given the task of being the chief librarian at the museum. And there are quite a number of important philosophers and other scholars who were involved in this. Now, did the museum produce? In fact, it did. A lot of great works of the ancient world were produced at the museum. To give a couple of examples, Euclid, whose name you may know, he was the original kind of the founder of the discipline of geometry. He did much of his work at the Museum of Alexandria. The ancient philosopher and scientist Eratosthenes did an experiment where he tried to calculate the circumference of the Earth. That's a misperception that people often have, that they thought that people in the pre-modern world thought the Earth was flat. All educated individuals in the ancient world knew the Earth was round. They did experiments to detect the curvature of the Earth. Eratosthenes did the most complex of these and came up with a calculation of around 25,000 miles, which is very close. It's within a few hundred miles of accuracy. So you can see the kinds of scholarly endeavors that were done at the museum. There was even a rather late figure, 1st century CE figure named Hero, who produced a working steam engine. Now, here I like to stop and ask the question, okay, well, if they produced a steam engine in the ancient world, why didn't they have an industrial revolution like we did in the late 18th and early 19th century, which was built largely on steam power? The answer is that they didn't need to, right? These were people working in the ivory tower of the museum. They had slaves at their beck and call. They really never made the connection between this device that moved something on steam power and the potential application of doing work on a massive scale with steam power. And so they never produced any huge steam engines or locomotives. This was really just a kind of curiosity. And it was, nobody ever really picked it up. The Greeks, after all, were far better at theoretical sorts of endeavors than they were at applied things. The Greeks made great scientists, kind of theoretical scientists. They were not very good engineers. They didn't really have the imagination for that. The Romans, on the other hand, were not great theoreticians, but they were fantastic engineers, and that's something we'll talk about when we get to the Roman period. So the museum was this tremendously important institution that kind of captures all of these major processes going on in the Hellenistic period. Another piece of evidence is the site called Petra. Now, if we go back to this map here, Petra is right there. And you can see that it lies outside of both the Ptolemaic and Seleucid Empire. It was, in fact, an independent kingdom inhabited by a people called the Nabateans. The Nabateans built Petra. Okay. To get to Petra, you have to walk, at least from one direction, you have to walk through this very narrow valley. At times the walls of the valley are only like maybe 20 feet wide. And you come around a corner and there's this gigantic sculpture monolith in front of you. You come out and this is what you see. And you can see how large people are compared to this thing. This is well over 100 feet tall. It's not even the biggest of these monoliths. This is a monolith. That means single piece of stone. The Nabateans carved this into the sandstone cliff face at Petra. And all of Petra is in this valley with these sheer cliffs going up, and there are like dozens of these monoliths everywhere. These were tombs built for the Nabatean kings. And you can even see still evidence of how they did this. There are the marks of the scaffolding. They did this with simple hammers and chisels, and that's it. Okay. Now, that's the Nabatean technique for building, carving monoliths into cliff faces. But the architecture, you may note, is Greek, right? You can see the columns here, the triangular pediment, the lintel. All of these features are quintessentially Greek. To look more closely, this is a Corinthian column, highly decorated, floral patterns and things like that. Very common in Hellenistic era sculpture. The Nabateans borrowed these things from the Greeks. However, not all of this is Greek. There are a few iconographic features of this monolith that are native Nabatean. These things are badly weathered, but originally they represented eagles, which was a symbol of the Nabatean people. This particular iconographic representation of an eagle is Nabatean. The Greeks did not show things this way. The urn up here is also Nabatean. An urn, a very fitting symbol of death and funerary things, so it's appropriate for being on the tomb. So the Nabatean urn is another piece of iconography that is Nabatean. So what we have here is a Greek-style building. The architecture is Greek, but the techniques for building are Nabatean, and some of the iconography of it is also Nabatean. Right? This is the process of cultural fusion, the blending of cultures together. We can see other examples. This pattern, this is also in Petra, on a different monolith. This is called the crow step, and it is a Mesopotamian symbol, Assyrian specifically, but it represents the ascent into the afterlife. And so we have not only Greek and Nabatean features, but also now Assyrian or Mesopotamian features, right? The blending of cultures together here. Okay, Petra is a wonderful example of that. This, I think, is probably my favorite picture of a monolith, because not only do you have the Greek-style stuff here, but you also have the Nabatean urn up here. Lots of crow steps over here, and then we have this other feature, which was added later by the Romans, who conquered Petra at the end of the 1st century, or rather the beginning of the 2nd century CE, so 500 years after the Nabateans founded Petra. And the Romans didn't know how to, I mean, their techniques of building did not include carving things into cliff faces. Rather, they built with masonry, and so the Roman arches here were added later by the Romans as a kind of supporting mechanism for the whole building. This later even was turned into a Christian church, and there were crosses that were carved into the building. And so you can see several centuries of architectural history in this one this one piece, right, with many different techniques, and again, the process of cultural fusion on full view. Okay, last piece of evidence is this. This is a map of the world that was produced by Eratosthenes. Now, this is just a kind of facsimile version of it, or a representation of the original map. Obviously, they didn't have typeface and things like that in ancient Alexandria. It comes from circa 220 BCE, and it might look quaint and really quite ridiculous, but I want you to note a couple of important things about this map. First of all, it gets a lot of the geography pretty accurate in the central regions of Greek, or rather Hellenistic civilization. You can see the Nile River here. It's quite detailed. There's even the split between the blue and white Niles down here. The major bend in the Nile. The city of Meroe, which was well into the interior of Africa, is shown here. Alexandria is shown very prominently, right? This is also highly mathematical and symmetrical, so drawing upon that Greek sensibility. You have the Mediterranean Sea and this mountain range of the Caucasus forming the x-axis. The y-axis is formed by the Nile River and the Black Sea here. And so, these things are, I mean, they're very mathematical and precise and symmetrical. Greece and the Aegean Sea and even Italy, I mean, these are fairly accurate representations that show how detailed the knowledge was that the Greeks had. I mean, the Arabian Peninsula is quite accurate in its detail. You can see the Tigris and Euphrates rivers here. But it also represents the limitations of knowledge, geographic knowledge at the time. They still believed, as Alexander did, that the Ganges River, for instance, flowed into the Eastern Ocean, and there was nothing beyond that. Alexander never crossed the Himalayas, so we didn't know about China or Japan or any of those things. To the north here, we simply have the term Scythians. The Scythians were, in the Greek view at least, the barbarians who lived up here in Central Asia. We'll meet some of them later. That was a catch-all phrase for those people. Same thing down here in Africa. They didn't know how far out Africa went, and they simply say these are the land of the Ethiopians, which is the Greek term, simply means black African, right? Same thing up here. Scandinavia is not present. There's an island up here with a question mark by it, so they didn't know. The British Isles are shown in some detail, but not exactly accurate, and so lots of incredible knowledge that people had in the 3rd century BCE, but also limitations of that knowledge. The really important point here, though, is that people in Alexandria, these scholars at the museum, understood that there was a much wider world out there. They began to think in terms of the universal, right? Alexander came close to conquering the whole world, at least as he envisioned it, after all. And so this wider world was of interest to them. It was no longer just the local circumstances of the polis that animated people. They understood the broader world, at least those who were kind of the educated elites in places like Alexandria. And that worldview would continue. The Romans, of course, are going to be the major heirs of this worldview. And so in next week's lectures, we will begin to take up the topic of Rome and see how all of this plays out in the Roman period.